So, have you seen The Loop? Do you guys know the movie? It's Jason Bourne. Jason Bourne, right. The latest one, Las Vegas, everything like that. So what I think is cool about like movies is that everybody hacks like in like 30 seconds, right? And the passwords are always like super easy. But that's not what the basis of this talk is all about. I'm a software engineer from Las Vegas, Nevada. I work on two projects. I work on a mobile app for a video training company and another application for a slot manufacturer for a UI framework using Angular 2. So some of what I'm talking about today is learnings from that Angular 2 project that we've built over the last 3 months now. So before I start, I kind of need to understand who you are. So how many people here have heard of material design? How many people are like super familiar with everything about material design? Who wants to learn more about material design? Okay, fair amount of people. How many people are actually building an enterprise application for their day-to-day? Okay. And how many people have to use an enterprise application in their day-to-day? Just about everybody, right? Okay, cool. So some of the things to think about with enterprise applications are that we have to use these things, right? We have no choice in deciding whether or not we want to use Outlook. We're just forced to use it, right? They're typically behind the firewall, and they're essential for productivity. If they weren't essential, we wouldn't have to use them, right? Things like HR and payroll, all these functions are typically what we expect from an enterprise app. But they're awful. Like this is what we can expect for an enterprise application. Too many choices, and the choices don't make any sense. I'm sorry for this side that you can't tell, but I'm pointing to force directories and spider check for files and clear server cache. Now, does anybody know if that clear server cache is going to do this immediately, or do I have to press another button for that to happen? It's not entirely clear, right? This is just a gigantic thing of checkboxes. But I have to admit to you, I've made bad interfaces before. I've sometimes committed crimes like this, but that was a long time ago. First off, we have to admit that we have a problem, right, before we can actually address things. And what I really find funny is that there's this little button down here called Pro Mode. Now, what is the professional mode of this application? Like, is it going to give me even more choices? It's really kind of a little bit hard to understand. I mean, I think Pro Mode would be a terminal command, and I could just type whatever I want, right? Now, even applications like Microsoft Word have committed crimes against humanity, right? I mean, if you look at the top, these gigantic toolbars have all these buttons, but they're like mystery meat. You have no idea what they're going to do until you press on them. And these are bad user interface designs. So let's think about what users want. I mean, it's obvious that they want simple and they want easy, right? And as a software engineer, like I really have a computer science degree, I think that what they want is like efficient applications, right? They want to know that I like sat there and I normalized my databases. I made sure that my SQL plan like ran 100% and everything like that. But actually that's not true. They actually don't care about anything I do. What they really care about is how it looks and how it feels, okay? And I say how it feels because when an application is slow, it feels wrong, right? But they can't actually articulate that to me, but they just feel like there's something wrong. And then they'll tell me that there's something wrong, but they'll tell me it in the wrong way. They'll all of a sudden tell me, oh, I should do such and such a thing, but they don't let me actually solve the problem, which is kind of interesting. So I want to build beautiful applications, and I think most developers actually want to be good to their users, right? We don't actually want to make bad applications, but the problem is that we spend a lot of our time heads down in the code, and what we focus on is maintainability, writing good unit tests, making sure that our server technology is good, but sometimes we make bad choices because of that. So maybe our components aren't structured in a way where we actually have a good user flow between things, right? And some of the things that you can do to kind of mitigate this is to structure your components in a way so that you can actually move them around and refactor things in an easy way, right? That's a little bit more advanced than we're talking about today, but I realize that I have really poor design skills. I'm not going to ever be a designer, but I like designers and I really enjoy working with them. So I actually started an Adobe user group to just hang out with them. And I'm not saying that this is what you have to do, but my point is that you have to embrace designers, right? You have to kind of understand where they're coming from. And as a developer, I realize that me and my kind are bad at making good user interfaces, right? This is just not like the thing that we are gifted at. But at the same time, designers are really poor at good engineering choices. Like the thing that I see time and time again is that the designer will start with a blank sheet of paper and they'll think that they can do anything, right? So they create these very complex user interface designs that aren't achievable. And they don't understand that if they worked with me a little bit, that we could actually come up with something that's quickly implemented and also beautiful at the same time, so that they can focus on the user experience part of it and not the user interface part of it, right? So what I'm saying is that you have to reach out, you have to work with your designers, and you have to get them to understand the constraints that are inside of your user interface components. So enterprise users are captive. They can't get out of these applications that we build for them, but they're also incredibly savvy because they have mobile devices, right? And if you don't give them a good user experience, they're going to break out of your walls. They're going to like download Dropbox, they're going to install Slack, and they're going to get around these things. And I also have to say, let's not invent user interface components on our own. Our jobs as software developers is to apply business rules and business logic and solve problems, right? Our job is not to be the world's best front-end user interface designer, okay? So what I'm strongly suggesting to you is don't go invent your own thing. Don't design the world's best button or card system. Use somebody else's. Evaluate what's out there. Figure out what makes sense for your company. If you're a Windows shop, take a look at Metro or the latest version of that. If you're a Google shop, you definitely have to look at material design. If you're not picking anything, take a look at everything and see what fits for your company, right? So it's easier to adopt these industry standards. Don't invent things that are already existing. Steal when you can, right? So material design has very strong guidelines, and this is why we actually chose it for the project that we did. And I wanted to give you a look at that so that you could see how good the documentation really is. What's going to be challenging is to make sure that people read the documentation, but as long as you can get your developers to look at this stuff and to search for it and try to implement it, you're going to be way further than most other companies. So for example, you can take a look at components. You can see that there's examples of cards. Like this is a beautiful example of a card with action buttons at the bottom. You can see that there's a card collection on the left here, that there are do's and don'ts, like you should have rounded corners for material design. You shouldn't have square corners, right? All this is provided to you. Why would you want to invent this stuff? Just use what's already out there. You can see here is an example of a photo application with what they call a floating action button that you click on to actually get the next item. So that's just an example of just the strong guidelines, not components, but strong guidelines for how you implement this stuff. And if you're implementing, say, a form or something like that, you can do a search. You can see text fields. You can see that the spacing of a text field, how it should be, where the label should be. You can see how help text should be displayed. That might be a little bit hard to see there. So there's help text for domestic cities only. How you should display error messages. It even actually talks about how your error messages should be worded and how your buttons should be worded. Did you know that an action button shouldn't be okay or cancel, right? It should be what you're going to do, right? So if you're going to create a user, your button should say create user, right? That's the action that you want to partake. So all these guidelines are out there. It's just a matter of searching for what you need, right? So Google just recently came out in the last 2 months, the material design components for web. Now they've had this for Android for a long time, and they recently introduced both iOS and web. If you're familiar with the Material Design Lite project, this is the next version of Material Design Lite, which is a framework agnostic JavaScript and CSS component set for implementing material design. So you can expect the components that we've been looking at, such as cards, right? Implemented with JavaScript and CSS and not dependent on Angular or React, for example. Now the project that we did, we decided to choose Angular Material 2, and because there were some limitations in that, we had to also use a framework from Teradata, which is a big data company called Covalent. What they did was they took the existing components in Material 2, and they built on top of it some things that were missing for us. For example, a data table. Almost every enterprise application is going to have a date picker and a data table, right? And if you don't have these things, you're not going to get very far. If you're using React, you can take a look at Material UI and the React toolbox. Looks familiar? And what's cool about the React toolbox is that it actually has a playground so that you can load in playground and then actually see the code right up above. And there's our card again. So all these things are free. You don't actually have to pay for them, and they're already available. So why would we ever design this stuff ourselves? And before I finish, what I wanted to do was to show you a little bit more about Teradata and the Angular components that are in there. So this is the Teradata documentation site. They have things structured in components. For example, file upload. They have expansion panels. They have chips, which is like an autocomplete, like you could type Los Angeles and fill that out. They have loading spinners, simple dialogues, customizable confirmations, agree or disagree, and of course, the data table that we were missing. And the data table has the standard things that we expect, like you can filter by search, right? LOL, and you get a lollipop. You have paging at the bottom, and of course you can reset everything back to the way it was. Pretty nice, right? Covalent comes with a quick start guide here that gives you an example of a well-architected application. Some of the hardest things to do when you're starting out in a project is to understand how these components fit together. So if you look at the quick start guide, you can actually get a sense of how the components fit together and how an application can be put together. They've done the work to have simple things like login screens, right? And even to the point where when you start to type something, that the 14/30 changes down there, right, to show you how many characters you had typed. So really solid component set, completely free. It's an open source project from Teradata. The guys that are there are doing great things with this stuff. I strongly suggest if you're using Angular to check it out. They've done sample applications of an email app implemented with Covalent. You have buttons, floating action button, icons, drop downs, right? Another example of a Slack channel, even with a side panel. And here's what that code looks like. You can see that there's a menu with a bunch of menu items. Very simple web components to work with. A set of contacts, so you can see what that might look like. Here's a little notification box. And a standard landing page, just like a website would be. So way easier to get started with Covalent. And that's why we chose it. We were missing some things in the regular Angular material. We saw that they had a lot of capability behind Teradata. We met them at the Angular conference and talked to them a lot. They're good guys. They're very responsive. You file a bug, you get something back from them. I highly suggest checking it out. Yeah, and at this point, any questions of what you've seen so far? Sure, go ahead.
Is Teradata free?
Yes, it's open source, completely free, yeah. Okay, so feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm fairly responsive there. You can also reach out to me on my GitHub account, Thak. And I thank you for listening to me today.